On a quiet morning in the spring of 1800, as Europe held its breath under the weight of endless war, few could have imagined that one man, recently cast aside by politics and exile, was about to gamble everything on a single audacious move. Napoleon Bonaparte, no longer just the revolutionary general of Italy but now the first consul of France, stood at a crossroads where ambition, survival, and destiny collided. France was exhausted by years of conflict, its enemies emboldened by his absence, and the Austrian Empire believed the balance of power in northern Italy had finally shifted in its favor. To many in Vienna, Napoleon was yesterday's hero, dangerous but predictable, his legend fading with distance. Yet beneath this surface calm, Napoleon was planning a return so bold that even his allies doubted it, a march that would rewrite the rules of warfare and place him face to face with annihilation. The Battle of Marengo would not begin on the battlefield itself but in the minds of statesmen, generals, and emperors who misjudged one another, and in Napoleon's own belief that speed, surprise, and personal will could overcome overwhelming odds. The political situation that led to Marengo was fragile and tense. After Napoleon's Egyptian campaign and the collapse of the French Directory, France had been thrown into instability. The Second Coalition, led by Austria and supported by Britain, seized the opportunity to reclaim territories lost during earlier French victories. Northern Italy, once firmly under French control, fell back into Austrian hands. To the Austrian High Command, this was not merely a territorial dispute but a chance to break French influence in Europe once and for all. They believed France was divided, its armies stretched thin, and its leadership distracted by internal power struggles. Napoleon's rise to first consul in late 1799 changed everything, but many of his enemies underestimated how quickly he could act. Diplomacy stalled, peace negotiations failed, and war once again became inevitable. Napoleon understood that a defensive war would slowly bleed France dry. To survive politically and militarily, he needed a dramatic victory, one that would crush Austrian confidence and secure his authority at home. Napoleon's strategy was built on deception and speed. While Austrian commanders focused their attention on the traditional invasion routes through southern Germany and along the Italian coast, Napoleon planned something almost unthinkable: an army crossing the Alps through paths considered nearly impassable for large forces. This was not simply a military maneuver but a political message. If he succeeded, it would show France that their new leader was unstoppable and show Europe that the old rules no longer applied. In May 1800, tens of thousands of French soldiers began the perilous march through snow-covered mountain passes, hauling cannons with ropes, human strength, and sheer desperation. Villagers watched in disbelief as artillery pieces were dragged across cliffs and frozen trails. Soldiers suffered from cold, hunger, and exhaustion, yet morale remained high, fueled by Napoleon's presence and the promise of glory. By the time the French army descended into northern Italy, they had achieved what many believed impossible: complete strategic surprise. Once in Italy, Napoleon moved rapidly, striking Austrian supply lines and defeating smaller enemy forces one by one. His goal was not immediate confrontation but encirclement. He intended to cut off the main Austrian army under General Michael von Mellers, trapping it between French forces and forcing either surrender or destruction. Confident after a series of swift victories, Napoleon began to spread his troops across the region, assigning detachments to block roads, secure towns, and chase retreating Austrian units. It was a calculated risk, based on the assumption that the Austrians were already in full retreat and desperate to escape back toward the east. Intelligence reports seemed to confirm this belief, and Napoleon trusted his instinct that the enemy's spirit had been broken. But war has a cruel habit of punishing overconfidence, and the Austrians were not as defeated as Napoleon believed. General Mellers, an experienced but cautious commander, was under immense pressure from Vienna to regain control and avoid further humiliation. Rather than retreating blindly, he decided to concentrate his forces and strike back unexpectedly. Near the small town of Marengo, on a sweltering June morning, the stage was set for a confrontation neither side fully anticipated. Napoleon himself was not immediately present with the forward French units, believing the main battle would occur elsewhere. The French soldiers positioned near Marengo were a mixed detachment, brave but thinly spread, unaware that they were about to face the bulk of the Austrian army. As the sun rose higher, dust clouds appeared on the horizon, and soon the reality became terrifyingly clear. More than 30,000 Austrian troops were advancing directly toward them. The initial clash was sudden and brutal. French infantry scrambled into defensive positions as Austrian artillery opened fire, tearing through ranks and shaking morale. What had been intended as a blocking force was now fighting for survival. Messages were rushed to Napoleon, warning that the situation was far worse than expected. For the first time in the campaign, the balance of events tilted sharply against him. The Austrians pressed forward relentlessly, using their numerical superiority to push the French back step by step. Smoke filled the air, wounded men screamed on the battlefield, and the heat of the day only added to the chaos. Every minute that passed increased the danger that the French line would collapse entirely before Napoleon could bring his scattered forces together. As Napoleon rode toward the sound of the guns, the full weight of his gamble began to reveal itself. His army, spread wide to trap an enemy he believed to be fleeing, was now dangerously exposed. The very strategy that had delivered surprise and early success threatened to become the cause of catastrophic defeat. The Battle of Marengo was no longer a planned engagement but a desperate struggle against time, miscalculation, and overwhelming force. France's fate in Italy, and perhaps Napoleon's own political future, now depended on whether he could transform near disaster into opportunity. The battle had only begun, but already it carried the tension of a moment where history could break in either direction, toward ruin or toward one of the most dramatic comebacks ever witnessed on a battlefield. As the morning of June 14, 1800, wore on, the battlefield around Marengo descended deeper into chaos, and the confidence that had carried the French army across the Alps began to crack under the weight of reality. Napoleon arrived to find his forward units already exhausted, their lines thinning as wave after wave of Austrian troops pressed forward with grim determination. The Austrians, believing victory was finally within their grasp, advanced methodically, their infantry supported by steady artillery fire that punished every French attempt to regroup. What Napoleon now faced was not a scattered enemy seeking escape, but a fully committed army fighting with renewed purpose. The miscalculation was undeniable. He had assumed caution and retreat where there was instead resolve and aggression, and the cost of that assumption was being paid in blood. Napoleon moved quickly to stabilize the situation, issuing rapid orders to consolidate forces and reinforce key positions. French units were pulled back and reformed under intense pressure, officers shouting commands barely audible above cannon fire and musket volleys. The ground itself worked against them, with narrow streams, vineyards, and uneven terrain breaking formations and slowing movement. Austrian columns exploited these weaknesses, driving wedges between French regiments and forcing them into a fighting retreat. Each step backward threatened to turn organized resistance into panic. The French soldiers fought with determination, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and increasingly surrounded. Casualties mounted steadily, men falling where they stood, others carried off the field with shattered limbs, while those still standing fought on with the knowledge that defeat was closing in. The Austrians sensed this weakening and intensified their assault. General Mellers, convinced the French were on the verge of collapse, committed more reserves to the attack. His objective was clear: break the French center, roll up their flanks, and force a complete rout. Austrian cavalry charged repeatedly, testing French lines and exploiting gaps created by artillery barrages. French cannons answered back, but ammunition was running low, and gunners worked frantically to keep pace with the advancing enemy. Smoke hung thick over the battlefield, reducing visibility and adding to the confusion. Orders were misunderstood, units became temporarily isolated, and the sense of control Napoleon usually exerted over a battlefield seemed to slip from his grasp. By early afternoon, the situation had grown desperate. French units near the village of Marengo were driven back, buildings changed hands multiple times, and the road behind them filled with wounded and retreating soldiers. The psychological impact was devastating. For many French troops, this was the first time they had seen Napoleon's army pushed so relentlessly. Rumors spread that the battle was lost, that Austrian numbers were endless, that retreat was inevitable. Napoleon himself remained outwardly calm, riding among his men, urging them to hold, to buy time, to believe that the situation could still be reversed. But even he understood that without immediate reinforcements, the army faced destruction. Losses on both sides were heavy, but the imbalance was clear. French casualties climbed into the thousands as the hours passed, while Austrian losses, though significant, were absorbed by their greater numbers. The Austrians believed they had achieved a decisive breakthrough. General Mellers, exhausted and wounded, delegated command to his subordinates, confident that the battle's outcome was no longer in doubt. This decision, seemingly minor in the moment, would later prove costly. Austrian commanders pressed forward but began to lose cohesion, assuming the French were finished and that only mopping up operations remained. Discipline softened slightly, formations stretched, and the urgency that had driven their earlier attacks began to fade into premature confidence. Napoleon, meanwhile, was gambling on time. Scattered across northern Italy were French divisions marching hard toward the sound of the guns. Among them was General Louis d'Issey, a trusted and capable commander whose troops had been sent away earlier to pursue what Napoleon believed were retreating Austrians. Messengers had been dispatched with desperate urgency, urging d'Issey to return at all speed. Every minute mattered. Napoleon ordered his remaining forces to conduct fighting withdrawals, trading space for time, refusing to allow a total collapse. French infantry formed defensive squares, repelled cavalry charges, and fell back in disciplined steps, their resolve sustained by the knowledge that survival depended on holding just a little longer. The battlefield by mid-afternoon was a scene of exhaustion and devastation. The heat was oppressive, water was scarce, and powder smoke clung to the air like a suffocating blanket. Wounded men lay scattered across fields and roads, cries for help mingling with the thunder of artillery. Horses lay dead among broken cannons, and entire units were reduced to fragments of their former strength. Napoleon's army, once confident and aggressive, now fought with the grim determination of men cornered by fate. Every decision carried enormous risk. A single failed counterattack or misjudged withdrawal could trigger a rout that the Austrians would exploit mercilessly. As Austrian forces pushed forward, believing victory assured, Napoleon prepared one final defensive line. It was a fragile barrier, composed of exhausted soldiers and limited artillery, but it represented the last chance to delay defeat. Behind this line lay the road to total disaster. If it broke, the French army would be forced into retreat under fire, and the campaign in Italy would be lost. The political consequences would be severe. Napoleon's enemies in France would seize on the defeat, alliances would fracture, and his authority as first consul could crumble almost overnight. Marengo had become more than a battle. It was a test of Napoleon's vision, judgment, and ability to recover from error. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, distant gunfire echoed from the east, faint but unmistakable. Some French officers dared to hope it was the sound of reinforcements approaching. Napoleon listened carefully, calculating distances and timing with the precision of a gambler counting his final chips. The Austrians, still advancing, did not yet realize that the battle story was far from over. What appeared to be the final act of a decisive Austrian victory was, in truth, the prelude to a dramatic reversal that would transform desperation into opportunity and turn Marengo into one of the most extraordinary moments in military history. The sound of distant gunfire grew clearer as the minutes passed, and with it came a fragile but powerful shift in the mood of the French command. What had begun as a faint hope now edged toward possibility. General Louis d'Issey was returning. His division, hardened by relentless marching and disciplined by experience, was moving fast toward Marengo, drawn by the thunder of battle and the urgency of Napoleon's messages. For hours, Napoleon had balanced on the edge of disaster, his decisions shaped by instinct as much as calculation, but now the battlefield offered him something he had nearly lost, a chance. Time, which had seemed his greatest enemy, might still become his ally. As d'Issey approached, the French line was barely holding. Units were shattered, officers wounded or dead, and ammunition dangerously low. Yet discipline remained, forged through years of revolutionary war. Napoleon ordered his commanders to prepare for a final effort, not a retreat but a counterstroke that could shock the Austrians at the very moment they believed victory was secure. The plan was simple and brutally risky. d'Issey's fresh troops would strike the Austrian advance head-on, while French artillery, hastily regrouped, would concentrate fire to break enemy momentum. It was not a carefully staged maneuver but an improvised response born from necessity. If it failed, the French army would collapse beyond recovery. d'Issey arrived in the late afternoon, his men dusty, tired, but still cohesive. He took in the situation at a glance and reportedly remarked that the battle was lost, but there was still time to win another. Those words captured the essence of Marengo. This was no longer about the morning's mistakes but about the final hour's resolve. Napoleon placed d'Issey's division at the center of the line, directly in the path of the advancing Austrians. The timing could not have been more critical. Austrian forces, stretched out by pursuit and dulled by confidence, were advancing without the tight coordination that had defined their earlier attacks. They expected resistance to crumble, not to harden. At Napoleon's order, the French guns opened fire with renewed intensity. Artillery rounds tore through Austrian columns, halting their advance and sowing confusion. Before the Austrians could regroup, Desaix led his infantry forward. The clash was violent and immediate. Muskets flashed at close range, bayonets met flesh, and the battlefield erupted in renewed fury. The Austrians, shocked by the sudden resistance, struggled to form coherent lines. What they had assumed was a broken enemy now struck back with unexpected force. Momentum, so crucial in battle, began to shift. The cost was terrible. Desaix himself was killed early in the assault, struck down at the moment his attack gained traction. His death sent a ripple of shock through the French ranks, but instead of weakening their resolve, it hardened it. Officers seized the moment, rallying their men with the knowledge that this was the last chance to honor their fallen commander and save the army. French cavalry surged forward to exploit gaps opened by the infantry and artillery. Austrian formations, already fatigued, began to falter. Orders were delayed, units hesitated, and what had been a confident advance turned into a desperate attempt to hold ground. Casualties mounted rapidly on both sides. The battlefield was littered with bodies, the wounded crawling or crying out as the fighting surged back and forth. The heat, the smoke, and the exhaustion blurred the senses of men who had already fought for hours. Yet the psychological balance had decisively shifted. The French now believed victory was possible, while the Austrians sensed, too late, that their advantage was slipping away. The absence of General Mellers from direct command compounded their confusion. Without a single guiding hand, Austrian units reacted unevenly to the French counterattack, some standing firm, others pulling back prematurely. Napoleon pressed the advantage relentlessly. He committed every available reserve, refusing to allow the Austrians a moment to recover. French artillery advanced with the infantry, firing at close range, shattering enemy morale. The coordinated pressure began to break Austrian resistance. What had been a near-certain French defeat only hours earlier now teetered on the edge of an Austrian collapse. Retreats turned chaotic as roads clogged with wounded and fleeing soldiers. Cavalry charges meant to stabilize the line instead deepened the disorder as frightened horses bolted through infantry ranks. By early evening, the transformation was complete. The Austrians, stunned by the reversal, abandoned the field in growing numbers. Thousands were killed or wounded, and many more were taken prisoner as French forces regained ground once thought irretrievably lost. The scale of the losses was immense. Estimates would later suggest that both sides suffered around 6,000 to 7,000 casualties each, a brutal toll that reflected the ferocity of the fighting. But the strategic impact was unmistakable. The French army, once on the brink of annihilation, now stood victorious. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Napoleon surveyed a battlefield that told two stories at once, one of his gravest miscalculations and one of his most extraordinary recoveries. Marengo had tested every aspect of his command, from political ambition to battlefield instinct. It exposed the thin line between genius and disaster, a line crossed and recrossed in the space of a single day. The victory secured French dominance in northern Italy and shattered Austrian confidence, but it came at a high cost in blood and lives. More importantly, it cemented Napoleon's image as a leader who could snatch triumph from the jaws of defeat, a reputation that would shape Europe's fate for years to come. In the immediate aftermath of the fighting, the fields around Marengo fell into an uneasy silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of small fires. What hours earlier had been a landscape of vineyards and quiet roads was now scarred by churned earth, shattered equipment, and the bodies of thousands of men who would never leave Italy. French soldiers moved cautiously across the battlefield, collecting prisoners, tending to the injured, and trying to comprehend how narrowly they had escaped destruction. Many of them understood that they had lived through a moment that defied normal explanations of war, a day when defeat had seemed inevitable until the very last hour. Exhaustion weighed heavily on every face, but beneath it was a growing sense of awe at what had just occurred. For Napoleon, the victory at Marengo was both a triumph and a warning. He knew better than anyone how close he had come to catastrophe. His initial deployment, his misreading of Austrian intentions, and his decision to scatter his forces could easily have ended his career and perhaps even his life. Yet the outcome told a different story to the world. News of the battle spread rapidly across Europe, carried by couriers and exaggerated by rumor. In Paris, The reports were received with relief and amazement. The first consul, still consolidating his power at home, had delivered the decisive victory France desperately needed. Political opponents who had quietly hoped for his failure were suddenly silenced. Marengo transformed Napoleon from a promising leader into an almost mythic figure, a man who seemed favored by fate itself. The strategic consequences were immediate. The Austrian army, stunned by the reversal and drained by its losses, was forced into negotiations. Within days, General Mellers agreed to an armistice that effectively handed control of northern Italy back to France. Fortresses fell into French hands without further bloodshed, and Austrian influence in the region collapsed. What months of campaigning might not have achieved was secured in a single day of brutal fighting. For Austria, Marengo was a humiliation that exposed weaknesses in command and coordination. For France, it was proof that the Revolutionary Army, under Napoleon's leadership, remained a dominant force on the continent. Yet behind the celebrations lay a darker reality. The human cost of the battle was immense. Thousands of families, both French and Austrian, would never see their sons return. The wounded filled makeshift hospitals, where surgeons worked relentlessly amid shortages of supplies and the constant threat of infection. Desaix's death was deeply felt within the French army. He had been one of Napoleon's most capable and trusted generals, and his loss cast a shadow over the victory. Napoleon himself reportedly spoke of Desaix with genuine grief, aware that the success at Marengo had been purchased at a terrible price. War had once again proven that glory and tragedy were inseparable. Militarily, Marengo became a case study in both failure and recovery. Historians would later debate whether the victory was the result of Napoleon's genius or a stroke of extraordinary luck. The truth lay somewhere in between. His initial error nearly destroyed him, but his ability to adapt under pressure, to hold his army together, and to exploit the enemy's mistakes revealed qualities that few commanders possessed. The Austrians, convinced too early that they had won, relaxed their discipline and failed to secure a decisive conclusion. Napoleon seized that moment with ruthless efficiency. Marengo demonstrated that wars were not won solely by numbers or plans, but by leadership, morale, and timing. Politically, the battle strengthened Napoleon's grip on France. The victory gave him the legitimacy he needed to push forward reforms, reorganize the state, and marginalize rivals. It reinforced the idea that France's future security depended on his leadership. Abroad, European powers took notice. Allies grew more confident, enemies more cautious. Britain, watching events unfold from across the Channel, recognized that Napoleon was not a passing figure but a long-term threat to the balance of power. Marengo marked the beginning of a new phase in the wars of Europe, one in which Napoleon would increasingly dominate events. For the soldiers who had fought there, Marengo became a defining memory. Veterans would speak of the suffocating heat, the relentless Austrian advance, and the moment when hope seemed lost. They would remember the sudden arrival of Desaix, the thunder of French guns, and the surge forward that turned despair into victory. These stories would be retold in camps and taverns for years, growing in intensity with each telling. The battle entered legend not because it was perfectly planned, but because it embodied the chaos and unpredictability of war, where outcomes could hinge on minutes and decisions made under unimaginable pressure. As Napoleon left the battlefield, he carried with him more than just a military success. He carried a lesson etched in blood, that even the boldest strategy could fail, and that survival depended on flexibility as much as audacity. Marengo did not simply secure Italy, it reshaped Napoleon's approach to command. He would remember the danger of overconfidence, even as his reputation continued to grow. The battle stood as a turning point, a moment when his star might have fallen but instead burned brighter than ever. In the broader sweep of history, Marengo became a symbol of comeback and resilience. It showed how quickly fortunes could change and how thin the line was between triumph and disaster. For Europe, it signaled that the wars unleashed by the French Revolution were far from over. For Napoleon, it was proof that destiny favored those willing to risk everything, even when the cost was nearly unbearable. The echoes of that hot summer's day would continue to shape campaigns, alliances, and ambitions long after the smoke had cleared from the fields of Marengo. As the dust finally settled and the armies withdrew from the shattered fields of Marengo, the true meaning of the battle began to crystallize in the weeks and months that followed. What had occurred was not merely a tactical victory but a defining moment that reshaped Napoleon's identity in the eyes of France and the wider world. Before Marengo, he was a bold leader with a reputation built on earlier successes. After Marengo, he was seen as a man who could survive his own mistakes and still bend history to his will. This perception mattered deeply. In an era where authority rested as much on myth as on power, Marengo elevated Napoleon beyond the role of a general and closer to that of a legend. His supporters pointed to the battle as proof that destiny itself intervened on his behalf, while his enemies quietly acknowledged that removing him would not be easy. The political aftermath inside France was immediate and profound. Napoleon used the victory to consolidate his position as first consul, silencing critics who had questioned his judgment and ambitions. The public, weary of instability and constant war, embraced the narrative of a leader who had saved the nation at the brink of disaster. Newspapers celebrated Marengo as a heroic triumph, often glossing over the early failures and emphasizing the dramatic reversal. This carefully shaped story strengthened Napoleon's grip on power and gave him the confidence to push forward sweeping reforms that would soon transform French society, law, and governance. The battle became a cornerstone of his legitimacy, a living example of why France, in his view, needed strong centralized leadership. Across Europe, Marengo altered calculations in royal courts and military headquarters. Austria, humiliated and weakened, was forced to reconsider its approach to the war. The armistice that followed did more than end a campaign. It shifted momentum decisively in France's favor. Other powers watched closely, recognizing that Napoleon was not just aggressive but resilient, capable of recovering from setbacks that would have ruined lesser commanders. Britain, still committed to opposing French expansion, began to view Napoleon as the central obstacle to lasting peace in Europe. The balance of power trembled as alliances adjusted to the reality that France, under Napoleon, was once again ascendant. From a military perspective, Marengo became a lesson studied by generations of officers. It demonstrated how intelligence failures and overconfidence could nearly destroy even the most capable army. Napoleon's initial mistake in dispersing his forces revealed the dangers of assuming enemy intentions without confirmation. At the same time, the battle highlighted the importance of flexibility, morale, and decisive leadership under pressure. The timely arrival of reinforcements, the ability to recognize an enemy's moment of weakness, and the courage to commit everything at a critical instant turned defeat into victory. Marengo showed that war was not a rigid sequence of plans but a living, chaotic struggle where adaptability often determined survival. Yet the human cost could not be erased by victory. The thousands who died at Marengo were not symbols or statistics to the men who fought beside them. For soldiers and families alike, the battle left scars that lasted long after political gains were secured. The death of General Say, in particular, reminded Napoleon and his army that even the most brilliant turn of fortune demanded sacrifice. Behind every triumph stood loss, grief, and suffering that history often reduced to footnotes. Marengo's glory was inseparable from its tragedy, a truth that echoed through every battlefield Napoleon would later command. As the years passed and Napoleon's empire rose and fell, Marengo retained its place as one of his most dramatic moments. Later victories would be larger and more carefully planned, while later defeats would be more devastating, but none captured the sheer tension of a leader standing on the edge of ruin and pulling victory back at the last possible moment. Marengo represented the essence of Napoleon's career: audacity, error, resilience, and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. It was the day when everything could have ended, yet instead, everything truly began. For history, the Battle of Marengo stands as a reminder that comebacks are often born from miscalculation and chaos rather than perfect design. It challenges the idea that great leaders are infallible, showing instead that their greatness often lies in how they respond when things go wrong. Napoleon did not win Marengo because he planned every detail flawlessly. He won because he refused to accept defeat, because he adapted faster than his enemy, and because he understood the power of timing and morale. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was on that hot summer day in 1800. And now, as you reflect on this extraordinary turning point in battle history, remember that stories like Marengo are not just about the past but about understanding how decisions, courage, and chance shape the world we live in. Agar APKO Hamari videos sa Sohi Malamat Milrahi Hain or AAPKO AZ high real or suspenseful battle histories Paran Hain. To Hamar channel KO like Karine, subscribe Karine, or bell notification button KO press Karine. Taka AAP हमारी लेटेस्ट वॉर सीरीज की वीडियोस मिस न करें।
हिस्ट्री हर जंग के साथ जिंदा रहती है और हम आपके लिए उसे हर दफा नए अंदाज में लेकर आते रहेंगे।